Okay, welcome to chapter 14, where we will begin adolescence. Our first chapter is going to be about psychobiological development. Now, it's important to keep in mind what the term adolescence means, and I'm going to stay on this slide for a second because it has the definition of adolescence there at the bottom. The onset of puberty through the beginning of emerging adulthood. So, puberty is the biological change that introduces adolescence. The onset of emerging adulthood is really more of a social thing, and so it's kind of imprecise. So just to give you some foreshadowing about the next segment of life, emerging adulthood, we've sort of decided in developmental psychology that we're going to call the period between 18 and 25 emerging adulthood. So adolescence basically is going to span the onset of puberty through the age of 18. All right, so what is puberty? Well, it's really important for you to be aware that the sequence of puberty, the sequence of the changes that the person's body undergoes, is very predictable, but the timing is not. And I think you guys all can remember from your early adolescence the fact that the timing is not necessarily very predictable. Different people start the signs of puberty very young. Others will display those changes very late. And all of that within the normal range. So timing is probably the thing that the individual is the most concerned with. You know, why are my peers ahead of me? Or why am I ahead of all of my peers? That's probably the thing that the individual is the most concerned with. But for developmental psychologists, we're most interested in the fact that once we see one sign, we know what the next sign is likely to be. So what do we mean by that? So there are some very private, only blood tests would reveal it kinds of changes that occur. For girls, the ovaries will start to produce estrogen and progesterone around the age of 9, but there's no outward sign of that. You would have to detect that through blood tests. Similarly, we have the uterus and vagina beginning to grow larger. You'd have to do some pretty intrusive analysis to recognize that that was happening within an individual. That happens around the age of 9.5 for girls on average. At that time, at that same age, boys now are starting to produce testosterone from their testes. And again, you would only know that from a blood test. Around the age of 10, girls start to develop what we call breast buds, which is swelling around the nipple, around the areola. And so a lot of girls are acutely aware of this stage because they start to notice this, this protruding, areola area. And some girls are very self-conscious about that. Others, welcome the onset of development. And so different people have different attitudes about that change. Meanwhile, for boys, the testes and scrotum start to grow larger, and they may not notice that because it's not a huge change. It's the beginning. Girls will start to develop pubic hair and will have what we call a weight spurt, where they'll put on some pounds. Right around age 11 is really typical. Now, some girls on average have a lighter frame, and so putting on a little bit of weight might be more noticeable. Other girls may have, a heavier frame, so putting on a little weight might not be as noticeable. So different people's experience of that weight spurt can really vary. Some are very self-conscious and they feel like they've suddenly gotten fat. Others don't really notice that they've gained any weight. The peak height spurt for girls is around 11.5, where they're growing the fastest. So there'll be a significant change in height through this beginning puberty. For girls, they'll really, really, I want to say spike up, but I don't think that's a phrase. They're going to have a really significant change in their height. And it could last over the course of 6 or 12 months where they'll really significantly grow. Now, this is average. The taller a person's going to be, the longer this period will last for them. And so you can have girls who are continuing to grow until they're, 16 years old if they're going to be particularly tall. Girls who are going to top out closer to 5 feet, they will for a period of time be towering over their peers who in the long run are going to be taller than them. So it's kind of an interesting little sort of disparity between people and how they develop. For boys, pubic hair starts to develop around 11 and a half. So you're seeing that basically boys are lagging about 6 months behind girls at this beginning stage of puberty development. Peak muscle and organ growth will occur for girls around age 12. So they're really quickly developing adult-sized livers and kidneys and things like that. During this period, oftentimes the hips will become wider than the waist. And very noticeably, they may start to put on some weight on their hips and on their thighs. And that can, again, be a real source of embarrassment for some girls because they feel like suddenly they've gotten fat, is what a lot of girls at this age report. And they'll report that they are trying to lose weight or they're doing other kinds of restrictive things because they think that they're not meeting the ideal at that time. For boys, about that same time, their penis is starting to grow. Around 6 months later, the average first menstrual period, so 12 and a half on average in the US is the first menstrual period. It's really closer to about 12 and a quarter right now, but the first menstrual period is called menarche. Spermarchy occurs, we're not exactly sure for boys because no one really tracks it, but sometime after girls, and sometime after the first period, then girls will start to ovulate. So you can kind of see this 6-month disparity between boys and girls, but this nice predictable pattern, even when we're talking about, female changes versus male changes, you see this very predictable pattern of what's likely to happen next. So you can kind of see the boys being peak muscle and organ growth being, a solid 2 years behind girls, and their widening tends to happen on their shoulders rather than girls happening on their hips. And so you see this voice changing, about 14 for girls, about 15 for boys. Final pubic hair pattern in place around 15 for girls, around 18 for boys. And then full breast growth is listed here at age 16, but I think a lot of girls who are listening to me can account for the fact that breasts continue to grow long after the age of 16. So we have this disparity between boys and girls. The thing that triggers the onset of puberty is what we call the HPA axis and the HPG axis. So the HPA axis is the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal gland axis. So the hypothalamus is a structure in our brain that is able to communicate directly with the pituitary gland, which is directly adjacent to the brain. It's not technically considered part of the brain, but it's like this little dingle ball that sort of hangs off the side of the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is able to directly communicate with the pituitary gland through a set of hormones. If you're really super interested in these hormones, I talk about them more specifically in human sexuality. But so the hypothalamus releases its hormones that activate the pituitary gland, which in turn releases hormones that activate the adrenal glands. It's a type of growth hormone that actually causes the adrenal glands then to boost adrenaline, testosterone, estrogen, things like that. And those hormones then contribute to the growth spurt and the development of the sex characteristics that I was just describing on the last table. And I'll get into primary versus secondary in a second. The hypothalamus also activates the pituitary gland to release something called gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is the HPG axis. So the hypothalamus tells the pituitary gland to release what we call GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. And that causes the gonads. If you're female, you have ovaries. Your gonads are called ovaries. If you're male, your gonads are called testicles, to produce testosterone and estrogen. So ovaries are going to produce estrogen, testicles are going to produce testosterone. And those hormones also contribute to the development of the sex characteristics that we're going to talk about. So these HPA and HPG axis patterns are what determine the onset of puberty. And so we're not exactly sure what exactly triggers the hypothalamus to start the secretion of hormones that are going to then activate the pituitary gland to activate the adrenals and the gonads. But that's what will start the sequence. Once the sequence has been released, it's going to go in a particular pattern. Oh, I labeled GnRH for us. Forgot about that. So what I would like you guys to really to drill down a little bit more closely, instead of just thinking about gonadotropin releasing hormone coming out of the pituitary gland, is that it has these very specific hormones that are called follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And both males and females release these from their pituitary gland, and they have different effects on the ovaries and the testicles. Basically, what luteinizing hormone does is it causes the structures that support the sex cells, so the structures that support the sperm or the structures that support the egg, to develop. And then the follicle stimulating hormone causes them to ripen. And so and mature and be ready for release, either in ovulation for the case of ovaries or in ejaculation in the case of testicles. So there are these very specific hormones that activate the different gonads to start to do their job. So I said we weren't really clear on what causes this sequence to begin. We have very carefully and cleverly sort of narrowed it down to some kind of interaction between genetic markers that help to differentiate among people, the state of health of the individual, and then environmental factors that can contribute to the maturation of these structures. So first off, let's talk about the growth spurt. Here we have the proportions of, on the far left, a baby who is 0.42 years old. So this is a baby who's probably 3 months old. So look how big the head is compared to the body in that 3-month-old. When you line them up like that, it does look pretty ridiculous how big a baby's head is compared to like their feet, right? As you work across, you see, by 0.75 years old, which, oh my gosh, as I record this video, my grandson is about to turn 0.75 years old in just a couple of days. So he's got that sort of, it kind of almost looks proportional if you take it out of context compared to older children or adults. That 0.75, you see that the body is really caught up a lot with the head. But keep looking, right? Because by 2.75 years old, the head is starting to look downright small compared to that 3-month-old. But look at the adult on the far right. You've got the 25.75-year-old adult. The head looks very small compared to the rest of the body if you compare it to a 3-month-old. And among mammals, we have really big heads as adults, but relative to body size, but we had giant heads when we were babies. And so you can kind of see as the person matures that their body is going to have to catch up with that cephalocaudal development that we had talked about earlier in infancy and up until puberty. Actually, puberty is when that cephalocaudal development finally stops. In puberty, now suddenly we're going to have growth of the body and not growth of the head. So it's a real flipping of all the things we had been talking about before. We'd also talked about proximodistal development. That's going to get turned on its head during puberty. Now suddenly the feet are going to grow really rapidly and the hands are going to grow really rapidly during puberty. On the right-hand side, we have girls versus boys, and we see this peak growth of girls happening on average about 2 to 3 years ahead of the average boy. I think probably most of you can think back to middle school and how the girls were so much taller and so much more developed than the boys. If you had an early developing boy, he had a lot of status in middle school because he was bigger than a lot of the girls. And if you had a girl who had reached her peak and was going to be, overall shorter as an adult, she had a little bit more status probably among the peers because of, being, our social expectation that girls should be smaller than boys or men should be taller than women was being met for those individuals. And so they had a little bit more status and maybe were more desirable among their peers because of those disparities. Whereas the average, the typical pattern is for girls to be taller than boys during middle school. You can see that in that chart. If you look between 12 and 14, it's really common for the average girl to be taller than boys. So let's transition into the primary sex characteristics versus the secondary. Primary sex characteristics are those characteristics that are going to involve the organs that are necessary for reproduction. So if you remember the table that I showed you at the very beginning, you probably noticed that some of the things that we were talking about, you would need to have those changes occur in order for a child to become a reproductively capable adult. So for girls, here's that chart again. We would want to focus in on, the ovaries producing estrogen and progesterone, the uterus and the vagina growing larger, menarche, reaching their first period. Let's talk a little bit more about menarche. So there's been a lot of discussion about, I thought I had a picture of this, so that's why I was going ahead. I guess not. What's called a secular trend in menarche, where girls today are achieving menarche about on average 4 years younger than girls in 1850. And so there's been a lot of discussion about why that age has dropped so dramatically. And lots of different things have been explored. Is it environmental? Is it, as in like there's pesticides in the environment now and it's doing something to the ovaries? Is it because of things in our diet? For example, is it because there are antibiotics in our meat, or because there are growth hormones in our meat? Is it because of, tainted water, that pesticides might be getting into water systems? The World Health Organization has explored all sorts of different hypotheses, and basically by comparing modern cultures where the average age is 12 and a half to modern cultures where the age is closer to 16, the big consistent difference is not pollution in the water, not growth hormone in the food, but actually is how much fat a girl lays down early on. It seems to be the case that a girl needs to have a body mass of about 100 pounds and a height of about 5 feet in order to trigger the onset of menstruation. Now, that's not perfect. Some women never reach the height of 5 feet. Some never weigh 100 pounds, and they'll still reach menarche. But we're talking about, on average, that proportion, 5 feet to 100 pounds. That allows for the proper balance of fat to muscle to allow the support of menstruation. So that seems to be the big change, is that girls are able to achieve that balance earlier than they used to be able to. And we think it's because of our healthier diets. Right, we have more food, we do less work. If you think about an 1850s girl, there was a high probability that she was, retrieving water from the spring, that she was walking, more than a mile to get to school, that, she had to do harder physical chores than girls today have to do. And then there were periods of time when there just was not enough meat or fat in the diet to get through, especially the springtime when, all the stores are, that they canned and all that stuff is gone. And so now they're literally barely making it, and then finally summer comes and they can start eating better again. But that kind of feast and famine situation prevented the buildup of the fat that it takes to be able to support menarche. So there we are. I thought I had a picture. I just had animated it wrong. So here we have the data that I'm referring to, where Norway started asking women a lot earlier than other countries did. How old were you when you had your first period? It's really common today. Any woman who's listening to me right now knows that every time you go to the doctor for even the most non-menstrual related purpose, you're asked, how old were you when you had your first period? It's just part of, female health, is understanding how old they were when they reached their first period. And part of that is because if you started significantly earlier, you're actually at risk for certain health issues. If you started significantly later, you're at risk for other health issues. And so it is a health related question. Norway started asking it as early as 1850. You'll notice the US didn't start asking it until 1910. No one seems to really be asking men about their first ejaculation, but maybe that's coming in the future. Anyway, this secular trend shows that the development of primary sexual characteristics has been dropping, the age of that. And so, sort of ethicists have been wondering about, how young can it go, right? Within the normal range, there are girls who are as young as 8 who will start menstruating, and girls as late as 16, that's still considered within the normal range. So there's this wide range of normal development. If you're significantly older than 16, they do start looking at possible problems that might be preventing menstruation. But starting early, there's really nothing to be done about it. So what we are looking at as far as our explanation for the secular trend is there's probably some predisposing genetic factors that have to be taken into consideration, because we do see differences among racial groups as far as the onset of menarche, and so that would probably best be explained through genetic differences. But within any group, there's a lot of variation, and so we have to look at things like nutrition and stress and environmental impact and chemicals and things like that. Now for boys, we have to be looking at, the testes producing testosterone, the growth of the testes and scrotum. Here's a nice sort of visual of what we're talking about with the growth, because I had said earlier, it's not that dramatic. But when you're looking at, at the beginning of puberty, you'd be over there on the 4 or 5 size testicles. And by mid-puberty, you're on the 8 to 10, so this is the volume measured in milliliters. It's not, from one month to the next, not necessarily that noticeable, but by the time a full adulthood has been achieved, the testes are 5 times the volume that they were at the beginning of puberty. So it is definitely noticeable in the end. Penis growth is going to begin. Don't worry, I'm not going to show you a picture of that. Spermarcy occurs where the boy has their first ejaculation. And like I said, we're pretty imprecise on our understanding of exactly when that is. We aren't really asking boys or men to report when was your first ejaculation. It's just not really a question. And part of that might be because a lot of boys and men aren't aware of when their first ejaculation was, because it might have come to them in a wet dream, we call it in the common vernacular. The scientific name is a nocturnal emission. And so they might have slept through it and just thought they wet the bed. They may not know that they had their first ejaculation until they finally know. And so it's a really imprecise thing, whereas there are very few girls in the world who do not recognize menarche. They may not know what's going on at first because their parents didn't explain to them. They weren't told what was going to happen, but they are aware that it has happened. And so it's like a flashbulb memory, right? They know that it has happened. So it's significantly different. And so we don't have specific dates on that. Secondary sex characteristics are all those physical changes that you, looking at this picture, can recognize that make it really clear that the 2 people in the middle are fully mature and the 2 people on the far outside are not, right? That there are these changes, independent even of the genitals, that signal to the world that the person is reproductively capable. We call these the outward signs of maturation. Right. So because so many of the biological, primary sex characteristics are really private, they are really like internal, would require blood tests to reveal. These are things that the person might not even be aware is happening to them until they achieve menarche or they recognize spermarchy. These are private events. And so nature set us up with outward signs that allow the rest of the world to recognize that this person is mature and is reproductively capable. These secondary sex characteristics have nothing to do with reproductive capability. So these outward signs are signals, but they don't help us to, become parents. They don't help us in any way as far as reproduction. They just help us to attract a mate. So usually when I'm in class, I like to ask students, what things are you noticing are different? And, it's not a really hard task, is it? That you notice, for example, for the female, the 2 big noticeable changes are going to be the widening of the hips and the depositing of fat around the breast tissue. Those are the major changes that occur that allow people who are completely clothed to still be recognized as mature. So even if she had her back to us, and she had clothes on, we'd probably be able to tell that the woman in the middle is fully mature. For males, there are more changes actually that occur than the outward signs. The shoulders broadening, the reduction of fat relative to muscle, so that the muscles look more pronounced on an adult male than they do on an immature male. The jawline gets more pronounced, and that actually continues throughout life. The jawline gets heavier for men. Their Adam's apple may start to protrude. That has a scientific name that's eluding me right now. I can't think of what it's called. Um, the development of beard hair on the face, maybe on the back and the chest as well. Um, the for both sexes, the development of armpit hair, pubic hair, and the thickening of hair on the arms and the legs occurs as part of secondary sex characteristics. Of course, females shave most of that off. Some males do that too, but those are signs. Those are outward signs of maturity. The let's see what else. The voice lowers significantly in men. So that's another way that sort of just by sound you'd be able to recognize that that was a mature man versus a young boy. So these are sort of these outward signs that allow the rest of the world to recognize this is an adult as opposed to a child. So the secondary sex characteristics are really the ones that most of us probably remember noticing as differences between us and our peers while we were growing up. Somebody might have been ahead of us or somebody might have been behind us, and that can have an impact on us. And then there's also that awareness of our own status in the primaries, especially for girls. Knowing whether they've had their first period or not is a big thing. So what happens when your signs of puberty are significantly earlier than your peers? Well, for girls, being significantly ahead of your peers has been associated with having a poorer body image in adulthood, lower self-esteem in adulthood, and higher rates of depression in adulthood. So the things that happen during this young period where, if you're, let's say, an 8 or 9-year-old girl who's already menstruating, or maybe has already started to develop breasts ahead of the peers, it oftentimes can attract attention that is unwanted. It is something that the young girl doesn't know what to do with. And so she can become sexualized. She can become the target of teasing, things like that. And a lot of you who are listening to me probably know what I'm talking about because it might have happened to you. And it's really harmful on the developing girl's psyche. It can really make her feel like her body is betraying her. And so we see these negative outcomes in adulthood of girls who had those experiences. It's really difficult that we don't all develop at the same time. And when there are differences, children tend to use those as topics for teasing or topics for, different kinds of harassment. So it's really unfortunate, but it is what happens. For boys, on average, we see that earlier developing boys tend to act out in ways that are usually not desirable. So they may be more aggressive. They may engage in more law breaking. They may start using alcohol early, things like that. Now, 50 years ago, being an early maturing boy was actually considered an advantage, and boys who matured ahead of their peers were looked up to by their peers, and oftentimes were treated with more status by the adults, and so they had better outcomes. They tended to be leaders among their peers and things like that. And but we've seen this change since pretty much the year 2000, where now we're seeing these early maturing boys tending to act out. So it's now the case that boys and girls who are early maturing are having more negative outcomes. If you're later than your peers, girls who are later than their peers oftentimes are very self-conscious about that. They're concerned about their stage of breast development or their lack of hip development, things like that. So they are self-conscious. Now, they don't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily follow them into adulthood with these major effects that we saw with the early developing girls, but we have this sort of overall insecurity that we see among girls who develop late. When they develop into adults, they're more self-conscious about their bodies. For boys who are later developing, we see some of the effects that we had seen in girls who were early developing, right? So we see boys who are more likely to be depressed as men. We see them feeling more anxious. They may be concerned about initiating sex because they feel a little inadequate, like maybe they aren't, knowledgeable enough, other kinds of things because they were late bloomers. And so boys who are late developers are more like girls who are early developers. Boys who are late developers are oftentimes the target of teasing. They can't get the attention of girls as easily. When you're in your age cohort and you're looking around at your peers as possible romantic partners, being younger looking than everybody else makes you less desirable to your peers, and the person internalizes that and they feel like they will always be less desirable than their peers, which is not the case. Ultimately, everybody develops and ultimately everybody is desirable to someone, right? So it's something that can follow them along into adulthood, just like being an early developer can follow a girl into adulthood. All right, I'm going to stop here. We will reconvene in the next segment and we can talk about appearance and other major concerns for adolescents.